The party made camp at 3:30 in the afternoon. This detail appears in the diary of Margaret Ashford, age 24, schoolteacher from Portland, Maine, traveling with the Whitmore expedition through the Bitterroot Range in late September 1896. Her handwriting on that particular page is unhurried, the letters even and clear. She noted the time, the quality of the light through the pines, and the fact that Dr. Henry Whitmore had decided they would stop early rather than push for the next established camp. The weather was fine. There seemed no reason to object. The expedition consisted of 9 people. Dr. Whitmore himself, a geologist of modest reputation studying mineral formations, his wife Catherine, Margaret Ashford, 2 graduate students from the University of Montana, James Heller and Robert Quinn, a photographer named Samuel Vance, and 3 hired guides, Thomas Gray, Michael Donnelly, and a Salish man known in the records only as Paul. They had been traveling for 11 days. The route was familiar to the guides. Paul had traversed this particular section of the range twice before that year alone. When Dr. Whitmore called the halt, Paul is reported to have gestured west and said something about the ridge. The exact words were not recorded. Whitmore thanked him and turned his attention to setting up the tents. Margaret's diary continues for another half-page. She described the smell of coffee, the arrangement of bedrolls, the conversation at dinner about a fossil Robert Quinn had found embedded in slate. She made no mention of concern. At the bottom of the entry she wrote, "Paul suggested we might reach the pass tomorrow if we started earlier, but Dr. W. thought it better to rest. We have provisions enough." In the Montana Historical Society archives, there is a surveyor's map annotated by Thomas Gray 3 years after the expedition. In blue pencil, he marked the campsite. Beside it, in small, careful script, he wrote, "We were 6 miles from the road. Could have made it by dark." The Bitterroot Range in autumn is a landscape that invites stillness. The light is golden in the late afternoon, the air clean and cool. For travelers from the east, it must have seemed vast but not hostile, beautiful in a way that suggested permanence rather than danger. Dr. Whitmore's correspondence from earlier in the expedition reveals a man comfortable with the wilderness, though not particularly experienced in it. He had hiked extensively in the White Mountains, had camped along the Hudson, and had once spent a week in the Adirondacks collecting samples. He trusted his guides, but also trusted his own judgment. In a letter to a colleague dated 2 weeks before the final camp, he wrote, "The country here is remote, but manageable. One must simply be methodical." The weather that day was clear. The barometric readings Samuel Vance recorded in his field notebook show steady pressure. Temperature at midday was 58 degrees Fahrenheit. There had been no rain for a week. The trails, though narrow and steep in places, were dry. Paul's suggestion about reaching the pass was noted, but not discussed at length. Thomas Gray later testified that he had agreed with Paul, but saw no need to press the point. The doctor was in charge, Gray said in his deposition to the county investigator. He wasn't a fool. He'd gotten us this far. Margaret Ashford's diary from the days leading up to the final camp shows a pattern of leisurely travel. The group rose late, often after 7. Breakfast took an hour. Dr. Whitmore frequently stopped to examine rock formations, to take measurements, to consult his maps. Lunch was a communal affair, sometimes lasting until 2 in the afternoon. There was an air of scholarly expedition rather than wilderness survival. Margaret described it as rather like a walking seminar. Catherine Whitmore kept her own journal, though it was never recovered. In letters she sent from earlier stops along the route, she described the trip as restorative and a welcome escape from the bustle of university life. She had packed 3 books, a sketch pad, and a small watercolor set. In one letter she mentioned that she was glad they were taking their time. "Henry works too hard at home," she wrote. "Here, he seems to breathe." The guides, for their part, operated within the understood hierarchy of such expeditions. Paul, Thomas Gray, and Michael Donnelly were hired labor. They offered advice when asked, carried the bulk of the supplies, set up camp, and kept watch at night. But the route, the pace, and the decisions were Dr. Whitmore's to make. This was not unusual. It was, in fact, standard practice. James Heller, one of the graduate students, later told investigators that he had felt no apprehension on the afternoon they made camp. "We had food," he said. "We had shelter. The guides seemed calm. I assumed they knew what they were doing. What no one recorded, or perhaps no one noticed, was that the light was changing earlier each day, that the nights were colder, that the wind, when it came, had begun to carry a different smell." At dinner that evening, the group ate canned beans, hardtack, and dried venison. Samuel Vance set up his camera and took a photograph by firelight. The image still exists in the archives. 9 figures arranged in a loose semicircle, faces shadowed but relaxed. Dr. Whitmore is leaning back on his elbows. Catherine is pouring coffee. Margaret has a book open in her lap. Paul is sitting slightly apart from the group, facing west. His expression is unreadable. After dinner, Dr. Whitmore made an announcement. He said they would depart at 9 the following morning. This would allow everyone to sleep well and have a proper breakfast. The pass, he said, was not far, and the descent on the other side would be easy. They would reach the road by evening and be in town by the following afternoon. No one objected. Thomas Gray later said he had considered speaking up. "I thought about it," he testified, "but the weather was holding. I figured one more day wouldn't matter." Margaret Ashford's final diary entry from that night is brief. She wrote, "Dr. W is confident we'll make good time tomorrow. I admit I'll be glad to sleep in a real bed again. The stars here are extraordinary." The temperature that night dropped to 39 degrees. The snow began at 4 in the morning. Paul woke first. He later told investigators that the air smelled wrong. A flatness, a weight. He stepped out of the tent and saw the sky had lowered. The stars were gone. The first flakes were small and dry, falling in a slow, deliberate way that suggested they would not stop. He woke Thomas Gray. The two men stood together in the dark, watching the snow accumulate on the pines. Gray asked if they should wake the doctor. Paul said yes. Dr. Witmore emerged from his tent at 4:20. He studied the sky, consulted his barometer, and asked Paul how long the snow might last. Paul said he didn't know. Maybe hours, maybe days. Gray suggested they pack immediately and try to reach the pass before the trail became impassable. Dr. Whitmore considered this. Then he said, "Let's wait until first light. We'll see how heavy it is. No sense stumbling around in the dark." This exchange was reconstructed from testimony given by Gray and Paul in the weeks following the expedition. Both men stated that Dr. Whitmore was calm, that he did not seem dismissive, that he appeared to be weighing the options carefully. Paul later said, "I thought he would change his mind when the sun came up. By 6 in the morning, 3 inches of snow had fallen. The temperature was 32 degrees. Dr. Whitmore called a meeting. He proposed 2 options. They could attempt to push through to the pass immediately, or they could wait for the snow to stop and leave once visibility improved. Catherine Whitmore, according to Margaret Ashford's later testimony, expressed concern about traveling in poor visibility. She said she was worried someone would slip or get separated, Margaret recalled. Henry agreed. He said we'd wait a few hours and reassess. The guides said nothing. James Heller asked if there was real danger. Dr. Whitmore said no, not if they were cautious. Robert Quinn asked how much food they had. Michael Donnelly answered, enough for 4 days, maybe 5 if they rationed. The decision was made to wait. By 8 in the morning, the snow was falling more heavily. Visibility had dropped to less than 50 yards. The trail, which had been clearly visible the night before, was now obscured. Paul and Gray walked a short distance west, toward the pass, and returned to report that the way was still passable, but would not remain so for long. Dr. Whitmore asked how confident they were that they could reach the pass. Gray said he thought they could, if they left within the hour. Paul nodded. Dr. Whitmore thanked them and said he wanted to confer with his wife. At 9 o'clock, the group was still in camp. The snow had not slowed. Samuel Vance later described the scene. Everyone was standing around, drinking coffee, waiting for someone to make a decision. It didn't feel dangerous. It felt like a delay. Margaret Ashford remembered Dr. Whitmore pacing near his tent, hands clasped behind his back. He looked like he was working through a problem, she said, not like he was afraid. At 9:30, Dr. Whitmore announced that they would wait until noon. If the snow had not stopped by then, they would leave regardless. Thomas Gray later said, "That's when I knew we were in trouble." At 10 o'clock, the wind picked up. The snow began to fall at an angle, driving into the trees, piling against the tents. The temperature dropped to 28 degrees. Paul approached Dr. Whitmore and said they needed to leave immediately. Dr. Whitmore asked if it was still possible to reach the pass. Paul hesitated, then said, "Maybe." Dr. Whitmore turned to Gray and Donnelly. "What do you think?" Gray said, "We should have left at first light." Donnelly said, "We need to go now or we don't go at all." Dr. Whitmore looked at the group. Catherine was pale. Margaret and the two graduate students were watching him, waiting. Samuel Vance was securing his camera equipment. Everyone was cold. "All right," Dr. Whitmore said. "We leave now. Pack only what we need." The camp was struck in less than 30 minutes. Tents were left behind. Anything not essential was abandoned. The group set out in single file, Paul in the lead, Dr. Whitmore and Catherine near the middle, Gray and Donnelly at the rear. They had traveled less than a quarter mile when Paul stopped. The trail had vanished. The landscape was white and featureless. The wind was blowing hard enough that it was difficult to stand. Paul conferred with Gray. They agreed that continuing in these conditions would almost certainly result in someone getting lost or injured. They turned back. By the time they reached the camp, it was 11:30 in the morning. The snow was now falling so heavily that the tents, even from a distance of 20 feet, were barely visible. Dr. Whitmore gathered the group and said, "We'll shelter here until the storm passes." Margaret Ashford later said, "No one argued. There was nothing to argue about anymore." The storm lasted 4 days. When it ended, the snowpack was 6 feet deep in places. The temperature had dropped as low as 18 degrees. The group had burned through most of their firewood by the second night and had begun breaking apart crates and equipment to keep the fire going. Food ran out on the morning of the 4th day. On the 5th day, Paul, Gray, and Donnelly set out toward the pass on their own. The snow was too deep to carry supplies. They intended to reach the road and bring back help. They reached the road in 9 hours. By the time a rescue party was organized and returned to the campsite, 6 more days had passed. Of the 9 members of the Witmore expedition, 5 survived. Paul, Thomas Gray, Michael Donnelly, James Heller, and Samuel Vance. Dr. Henry Whitmore, Catherine Whitmore, Margaret Ashford, and Robert Quinn died of exposure and starvation between the 6th and 10th days after the storm began. The investigation that followed was thorough but inconclusive. No one was found to be criminally negligent. The weather had been unpredictable. The decision to wait had been made in good faith. Dr. Whitmore, though not an experienced mountaineer, had relied on his guides, who had themselves misjudged the severity of the storm. In his testimony, Thomas Gray was asked why the group had not left immediately when the snow began. He said, "The doctor wanted to be sure. He didn't want to risk anyone getting hurt in the dark." Paul was asked the same question. He said, "I don't think he believed it would be that bad." James Heller, one of the survivors, was asked if he thought Dr. Whitmore had made a mistake. He paused for a long time before answering. "I think he thought he had more time," he said. "We all did." Samuel Vance's photographs from the expedition were published in several Eastern newspapers. The final image, the one taken by firelight on the last calm evening, appeared with the headline, "Final Hours of the Witmore Party." The photograph shows no hint of what was to come. Everyone looks comfortable, even content. In the archives, there is a letter from Margaret Ashford's mother to the governor of Montana, written 3 months after the bodies were recovered. She wrote, "My daughter was sensible and prudent. I cannot understand why she did not insist they leave. I cannot understand why no one did. The answer, insofar as there is one, appears in the survivor testimonies. Everyone had deferred to Dr. Whitmore. Dr. Whitmore had deferred to his assessment that the storm would pass, that rushing in poor visibility was more dangerous than waiting, that they had time. The guides had disagreed, but had not forced the issue. When asked why, Gray said, "It wasn't my place to give orders. I was hired to assist." Paul was more direct. "I told him," he said. "I told him twice. He didn't listen." In his final journal entry, recovered from his body, Dr. Whitmore wrote, "The snow continues. We are conserving fuel and food. I remain confident that we will weather this without incident. It is simply a matter of patience." The entry is dated 3 days before he died. The Witmore expedition is not well known outside of regional historical circles. It does not appear in major studies of wilderness disasters. It was not the deadliest such incident of the era, nor the most dramatic. 4 people died, 5 survived, and within a year, the event had faded from public attention. What remains is a file in the Montana Historical Society, a few photographs and a handful of personal effects. Margaret Ashford's diary, Samuel Vance's field notes, the surveyor's map marked by Thomas Gray. The file also contains a brief report written by the county coroner. In it, he notes that the bodies showed no signs of struggle or panic. They had been found in their tents, lying as if asleep. The cause of death in each case was determined to be hypothermia, complicated by malnutrition. The coroner concluded his report with a single observation. There was no singular catastrophic event. The party simply waited too long. This is the detail that lingers. There was no avalanche, no sudden storm, no moment of clear and obvious peril. The danger accumulated slowly, almost politely. Each decision to wait seemed reasonable in isolation. Taken together, they were fatal. Dr. Whitmore was not a reckless man. He was cautious, perhaps overly so. He wanted to be certain before committing his group to a difficult course of action. He consulted his instruments, his guides, his own experience. He weighed the risks, and at each juncture, he concluded that it was safer to wait. Paul and Thomas Gray, for their part, knew the risks, but did not override the man in charge. They offered advice. They expressed concern, but they did not insist, did not refuse to follow orders, did not force the issue. Margaret Ashford, Catherine Whitmore, the graduate students, all deferred to Dr. Whitmore's authority. They trusted that he knew what he was doing, that the guides would speak up if there was real danger, that surely someone would say something if the situation were truly urgent. And so, the hours passed. The snow fell, the temperature dropped. And by the time everyone agreed that they needed to leave, the opportunity had closed. In the years following the disaster, Thomas Gray became a wilderness guide of some renown. He trained others in backcountry travel and survival. In his lectures, he often spoke about the Witmore expedition. He never assigned blame. He simply described what had happened and asked his students to consider what they would have done. One student, in a letter preserved in the Gray family papers, wrote, "Mr. Gray asked us when we would have left. I said I would have left at first light as soon as the snow started. He nodded and said, 'That's easy to say now.'" Paul continued to work as a guide for another decade before returning to the Salish reservation. There is little record of his later life. In one of the few interviews he gave, conducted in 1904 by a journalist from the Missoulian, he was asked if he blamed himself for the deaths. He said, "I told them what I knew. They didn't believe the mountain would move that fast." Samuel Vance never returned to wilderness photography. He moved to San Francisco and opened a portrait studio. In a letter to a friend, written in 1898, he mentioned the expedition only once. "I still have the camera I carried on that trip. I haven't used it since. I don't think I ever will." James Heller completed his degree and became a professor of geology. He never published anything about the Witmore expedition. When asked about it in later life, he would say only that it had taught him the importance of decisiveness. Michael Donnelly continued to work in the Bitterroots until his death in 1911. He rarely spoke about the expedition. When he did, it was to say that bad weather was not the problem. "The problem," he said, "was thinking we could wait it out. The site of the final camp is unmarked. It can be located using the coordinates from Gray's annotated map, but there is nothing there now except forest and stone. The trails have long since been rerouted. The pass the group was trying to reach is accessible by logging road." In the Montana Historical Society archives, the file on the Witmore expedition is thin, a few dozen pages, some photographs, a map. The documents are fragile and must be handled with gloves. The last item in the file is a handwritten note, Author unknown, date unknown. It appears to have been left by a researcher at some point in the intervening years. It reads, "They had all the time in the world, until they didn't." This is perhaps as close as anyone has come to explaining what happened on that hillside in September 1896. There was no villain. There was no sudden calamity. There was only a series of small, reasonable decisions that, in aggregate, became irreversible. Dr. Whitmore thought he was being prudent. The guides thought they had made their concerns clear. The others thought someone else would object if things were truly dangerous. Everyone thought there was still time. And then, very quietly, there wasn't.